Are you ready to uncover some of the earliest and most mysterious teachings of the Christian faith? In this video, we're about to dive deep into a remarkable ancient text, one that not only reveals how the very first Christians approached baptism and the Eucharist, but also sheds light on controversial subjects like abortion, the second coming of Christ, and the apocalyptic end of the world. Stay with me until the end, because the document we'll explore, known as the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 Apostles, offers a one-of-a-kind glimpse into the beliefs and daily practices of the early church. By the time you've watched this entire video, you'll gain a richer, fuller understanding of how the earliest Christian communities lived and worshipped, and you'll walk away with deeper insights that can still inspire us today. If you enjoy unraveling the secrets of ancient texts and discovering how they shaped the faith and traditions of millions, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Don't miss future videos where we examine hidden histories and forgotten scriptures that could change how you look at the Bible and early Christianity. Let's get started. The Didache, also known as the teaching of the 12 Apostles, is one of the most fascinating historical documents handed down to us from the early church. Imagine holding a practical handbook that guided the very first generations of believers, showing them exactly how to perform baptisms, how they should partake in Holy Communion, and how to handle moral dilemmas in an age of religious upheaval. The Didache gives us answers to some crucial Christian mysteries, such as how did the first Christians practice baptism? How did they observe Holy Communion, also known as the Eucharist? How did they approach moral and social issues like abortion? And what were their thoughts about the world's end and the second coming of Christ? Before we delve into the details, let's make sure we're crystal clear on what exactly the Didache is. The word Didache, often spelled E-D-I-D-A-C-H-E, comes from the Greek word Didache, which means teachings. Think of it as an instructional guide, something like a religious community's field manual, if you will. The Didache as we have it today is roughly the length of the New Testament book of Galatians. It's compact, only about 16 chapters, and is pretty easy to read. In fact, you could get through it in about 20 minutes if you read it straight through. As a practical example, consider how modern churches have instructional classes or small booklets explaining the faith to new converts. The Didache might be seen as an ancient equivalent, something that could guide a new believer's first steps into the faith community. While today's churches might offer pamphlets or digital downloads with baptism guidelines, prayer instructions, and statements of faith, the Didache served as an early prototype, ensuring everyone was on the same page. There's a common misconception that the Didache was once part of the Canonical New Testament and was later thrown out. However, the truth is that it never actually reached the status of canonical New Testament scripture. At least there is absolutely no credible evidence supporting that idea. When we look at canonical lists passed down by early church fathers, we don't find the Didache included. Instead, it surfaces in writings that acknowledge it as a familiar but non-canonical text. For instance, the historian Eusebius of Caesarea mentions it as not canonical, but still known and widely recognized among churchmen of his time. It also appears in a list by Athanasius of Alexandria, who cites it as other books, not recognized as canonical, but still recommended by the early believers for those who had just recently entered the faith and wished to learn. Similarly, in a text called the Analecta, attributed to the Patriarch Nicephoros of Constantinople, the Didache is also listed among New Testament Apocrypha. Even though it was never kicked out of the Bible, it maintained a relatively high status and was considered valuable supplementary reading. The version of the Didache that we possess today can be dated roughly between the years 110 and 120 CE. But why say the version we have today? Because the Didache is what scholars call composite text. It wasn't simply written by one person at one time. Instead, it weaves together several older Jewish and Christian sources and then later editors, early church leaders, redacted and stitched these sources into what we have now. Eventually, someone known as the Didachist, or the compiler of the Didache, undertook a final editorial process. We may never know the exact identity of this Didachist. This mysterious figure will likely remain anonymous for all time. But there are some things we can infer. Whoever wrote, or more accurately redacted, the Didache was likely a Christian church leader living at the end of the 1st century and the dawn of the 2nd. This individual's work created what might be considered the world's first church handbook, or at least the earliest one to survive to our own day. This didachist almost certainly had a sphere of influence within a local Christian community. He was deeply rooted in both Jewish and Christian tradition, often quoting from the Old Testament and referencing Jewish non-biblical sources. Furthermore, the Didache demonstrates a strong familiarity with Jewish prayers and ritualistic practices. For instance, consider how some churches today incorporate elements of their historical liturgy, like readings of the Psalms or traditional forms of prayer, into their worship. The Didachist was doing something similar, pulling from both Jewish and emerging Christian rites. Scholars often date this text to the early 2nd century, precisely because it reflects a period when Christianity and Judaism were beginning to move apart. The rituals, prayers, and moral instructions hint that the community this document served was influenced strongly by Jewish tradition, but was slowly shaping a distinct Christian identity. There's another widespread misconception that the Didache was written entirely in the 1st century and might even predate some New Testament texts. This statement is a yes and no situation. It's true that some of the sources within the Didache are quite old, some possibly reaching back to the 1st century BCE, yet the final redacted form we have took shape in the early 2nd century. The Didache is like a grand tapestry of earlier material woven together. For example, the first 6 chapters of the Didache incorporate something known as the Tractate on the Two Ways. This now lost Jewish text, heavily revised and Christianized over time, likely originated much earlier. The two ways motif, a way of life versus a way of death, was a common theme in Jewish community documents, some of which were found among the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. These shared patterns help historians piece together a timeline. It's as if the didachist reached back into a rich literary treasure trove to compile a guide that would resonate with early believers who were navigating a religious world still in flux. Now, we won't delve into every intricate detail here, but as you can already see, dating the Didache isn't straightforward. Scholars must be careful about what exactly they are trying to date. Are they attempting to date the original Jewish and Christian source materials that the Didachist wove into the text? Or are they trying to date the final redacted version that we now have in our hands, or rather, in our libraries and digital repositories? As far as experts can tell, the materials that contributed to the Didache's final form came mainly from the 1st century, both in written and oral form. However, the editorial pen of the Didachiste, the final compiler, likely made its mark in the early 2nd century. Evidence supporting this 2nd century timeframe appears in passages showing that Christianity and Judaism were in the early stages of their gradual split. By the Didache's final redaction, Jewish and Christian communities were still intertwined in some places, yet drifting apart in others. Imagine you have a recipe book that has been passed down for generations, with new cooks adding their own notes and substitutions over the years. The heart of the recipes might be centuries old, but the final version you're reading now might have been assembled relatively recently. That's the situation with the Didache's dating. Old ingredients, but a newer, edited compilation. Turning now to another puzzle, we also don't know precisely where the Didache was written or compiled. This question intrigues scholars because if we could pinpoint the region of origin, be it Egypt, Syria, Palestine, or somewhere else in the ancient Mediterranean world, it could give us a better sense of how Christianity spread and evolved in those early years. By understanding the cultural and historical context of a particular location, historians might decode subtle hints in the text. For example, specific prayers that resembled Jewish synagogue traditions in one region, or instructions that correspond to known Christian travel customs in another. It's a bit like analyzing the accent accent and vocabulary of a speaker, if you know where they're from, you can guess what influences shaped their speech. Similarly, if we knew exactly where the Didache originated, we could draw more precise conclusions about the practices it describes. Most scholars, after combing through linguistic patterns, early Christian references, and archaeological finds, have narrowed down a few strong possibilities. Many believe the Didache emerged either in Egypt or in the Syria-Palestine region. Let's look at Egypt first. We know that an Egyptian early church father, Athanasius of Alexandria, was familiar with the Didache. Moreover, 2 small fragments of the document were found in a trash dump at Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, an ancient city rich in archaeological discoveries. These tiny scraps of papyrus reinforce the notion that the Didache circulated at least somewhat in Egyptian Christian communities. Just as modern scholars can find traces of a text on old discarded manuscripts, digital backups, or scribbled notes, archaeologists have found evidence that early Egyptian believers knew about and presumably valued this text. On the other hand, a compelling case can also be made for the Syria-Palestine region. The Didache provides detailed instructions on how to welcome itinerant Christian apostles, traveling teachers, prophets, and evangelists who moved from community to community. Such a practice seems to align more naturally with the Christian customs we know were observed in the Syria-Palestine region during the early 2nd century. Consider how, in today's world, some religious traditions emphasize itinerant preaching more than others, with roving evangelists or guest teachers still playing key roles in certain communities. The Didache's detailed guidance on welcoming, testing, and hosting these traveling apostles suggests a community where this was a living issue. While itinerant ministry may have been less common in early 2nd century Egypt, it seems more at home in the environment of Syria-Palestine. Unfortunately, despite these compelling clues, we still don't have enough conclusive evidence to decisively pinpoint the Didache's birthplace. Without a firm location, the text retains an aura of mystery, encouraging ongoing debate and research. Historians would love a smoking gun, a marginal note by a scribe that reads, "copied in Antioch in the year," or a letter from a church father explicitly stating that the Didache was compiled in a known city. Until then, the quest continues. What makes the Didache so unique among early Christian writings is its practical nature. Unlike many texts that focus on theological correctness, orthodoxy, the Didache is more concerned with orthopraxy, meaning it cares deeply about the proper way of living and conducting oneself as a believer. Instead of offering extended theological arguments like we find in Paul's letters, or tackling complex doctrinal disputes like some later church fathers did, the Didache shows you how to do church in a nuts and bolts day-to-day manner. This is no high-flying theological treatise. Instead, it's more like a church operations manual or a communal rule book. If you've ever served on a church committee or read a church handbook that explains how to organize worship services, train volunteers, or administer sacraments, you've got a modern analogy. The Didache wants you to know how to act like a Christian in practical terms, how to treat others, how to fast, how to pray, and how to handle the sacraments. Because it's so focused on everyday practice, it's tricky to know exactly what the Didachist believed about theology. Did he think like Paul, or did he align with the Gospel of Matthew's community? Or did he embrace traditions now lost to time? Was he aware of all 4 canonical Gospels, or just 1 or 2 of them? Or perhaps other now unknown Gospels floating around in different regions? Did he read Paul's letters, or did he rely on oral traditions passed along by word of mouth from teacher to student in a tight-knit religious community? Scholars debate these questions extensively, and they may never reach a complete consensus. What we can say is that the Didachist likely knew something of Matthew's Gospel, and maybe Luke's, at least in a form somewhat close to what we have today. Many of the moral teachings, ethical guidelines, and even some liturgical elements have parallels, though not exact replicas, in certain New Testament passages. For example, when the Didache says, "Whatever you do not want to happen to you, do not do to another," this echoes the familiar golden rule from Matthew 7:12. Similarly, the Didache encourages believers to bless those who curse them, pray for their enemies, and fast for those who persecute them. These instructions ring a bell for anyone who has read the Sermon on the Mount, especially Matthew 5. Although not word for word the same, these parallels hint that the Didache, or his sources, knew some teachings attributed to Jesus that we also find in the New Testament, be it through a known gospel, a now lost gospel, or simply a well-preserved oral tradition. We could go on citing numerous examples where the Didache's sayings echo familiar passages from the New Testament. Scholars point out that the Didachist likely had access, whether directly or indirectly, to some early form of Matthew's Gospel, and possibly even Luke's. Another intriguing theory is that the Didache drew on what modern scholars call the Q tradition. The Q source, if you're not familiar, is a hypothetical collection of Jesus' sayings that many scholars believe Matthew and Luke both used as a common reference. Picture an early Christian community passing around a special quote book that preserved Jesus' teachings, which could have been shared orally and later written down. Over time, as the New Testament took shape, Q itself vanished from history, if it ever existed in a written form, leaving us only with its probable remnants in Matthew, Luke, and, as some suspect, in documents like the Didache. For those who want to explore the Q tradition further, some historical researchers and biblical scholars have produced extensive studies and even entire video series discussing it. Understanding Q can help us appreciate the Didache's relationship with the early Christian textual landscape. Unlike today, when we have printed Bibles, digital editions, and well-established canons, the Didachist lived in a time of flux. Gospels circulated in different regions, letters were copied by hand, and teachings might have been memorized rather than read. Imagine a marketplace of ideas where text and oral tradition commingled. In such a context, it's both challenging and fascinating to trace how and where the Didachist acquired his material. One persistent question with any ancient text, including the Didache, is, do we have the original manuscript? Sadly, the answer is no. Just as we lack the original, author-signed copies of the New Testament Gospels or Paul's letters, we also don't have the initial master copy of the Didache. Instead, what we possess today comes from later copies and quotations preserved over centuries. Early church fathers like Athanasius of Alexandria, Clement of Alexandria, and Eusebius of Caesarea mention or allude to the Didache, giving us indirect glimpses of how it circulated and influenced early Christian communities. However, it's not until many centuries later that we stumble upon a more complete manuscript. The first almost complete manuscript of the Didache that we know of is called the Codex Hierosolymitanus, or the Brynnios manuscript, named after the man who rediscovered it in the late 19th century. This manuscript was copied in 1056 CE, and the scribe who worked on it even gives us his name and the exact day he finished, Tuesday, June 11th, 1056. This is quite rare. Think of it as having a personal note from a medieval librarian telling you when they completed their careful transcription. The scribe, who humbly refers to himself as Leon the notary and sinner, offers us a human touchpoint in the long chain of transmission that brought the Didache from antiquity into the modern world. Additionally, we also have two extremely fragmentary parchment leaves dating from the end of the 4th century, known as the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 1782. These tiny scraps, rescued from an ancient Egyptian rubbish heap, are like puzzle pieces from a lost world. Though the fragments are small and incomplete, scholars believe they came from a miniature codex that may have contained the entire Didache. Finding these fragile remnants is like stumbling upon a long-lost ingredient list from an ancient recipe. Even if it's incomplete, it confirms that the text existed, was copied, and presumably read or taught in an early Christian community. These two sources, the Brynnios manuscript and the Oxyrhynchus fragments, are the only direct textual witnesses of the Didache we currently possess. Everything else comes indirectly, through quotations, references, and early church commentaries. That's why historians and biblical scholars celebrate the Didache as a precious window into the early church's spiritual life and community organization. It's a snapshot of a transitional time when believers were still ironing out their identity and practices, deciding how to baptize, how to gather for Eucharist, and what moral guidelines to follow. And speaking of guidelines, people often ask, what specific practices described in the Didache still intrigue us today? Baptism is a prime example. The Didache 7:1-4 instructs believers to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, echoing the Trinitarian formula we recognize from Matthew 28:19. The text recommends using running water, presumably a flowing river or stream, if available. If not, using other water, cold, warm, or even simply pouring water over the head 3 times is acceptable. This instruction undercuts centuries of fierce debate within various Christian traditions about the right way to baptize. The Didache seems flexible and pragmatic, caring more about the act's sincerity than the exact method. As a practical example, imagine early Christians in a remote village without a nearby river. According to the Didache, they need not panic. They could use a basin of water or even a few pitchers of water poured gently over the head. The text's adaptability reminds us that the earliest Christians were often improvising rituals in diverse environments. This guidance on baptism also mentions that the person performing the baptism, as well as the one being baptized, should fast beforehand, along with anyone else who can join in solidarity. That's an interesting detail, suggesting a communal preparation that heightened the spiritual significance of the event. Another significant element discussed in the Didache is the Eucharist, also known as Holy Communion or the Lord's Supper. This ancient text provides one of the earliest glimpses we have into how the first Christians celebrated the Eucharist. Consider Didache 9:1-3, where the instructions offer a liturgical formula. Believers should first give thanks over the cup, thanking God for the holy vine of David. Next, they give thanks over the bread, acknowledging the life and knowledge made known through Jesus. What's fascinating here is the specificity. Rather than simply saying, "Take this bread and cup," the Didache shows the community's prayers of gratitude, linking the Eucharist not only to Jesus' sacrifice, but also to the heritage of David, rooted in the soil of Jewish tradition. In Didache 9:5, the text commands that no one eat or drink of this Thanksgiving meal unless they have been baptized in the name of the Lord. It's almost like a membership rule, baptism as the formal initiation before partaking in this sacred communal feast. This exclusivity, while potentially controversial by modern standards, reveals how seriously the early Christians took their rituals. The community viewed the Eucharist as something precious, holy, and not to be taken lightly. For them, it wasn't a casual snack after worship, but a profoundly symbolic and unifying act. Think of it as a spiritual milestone. Those who had passed through the waters of baptism had demonstrated their commitment and were thus welcomed at the family table of faith. Interestingly, the Didache does not contain the familiar words of institution that many Christian traditions now consider central to the Eucharist. These words, "This is my body given for you, and this is my blood shed for you," are found in the Synoptic Gospels and in Paul's letters, and are routinely repeated in Christian liturgies worldwide. Their absence in the Didache suggests that the earliest communities might have had multiple ways of understanding and celebrating the Eucharist. Today, some churches cannot imagine communion without the words of institution, but the Didache shows us that the earliest believers might have experienced the Eucharist differently, focusing more on prayers of thanksgiving than on a strict formula of words. This historical insight can remind modern believers that Christian rituals have evolved over time, and that what's considered standard today may not have been universal in the earliest decades of the faith. Beyond these sacramental instructions, the Didache also addresses moral and ethical behavior. For example, it forbids abortion, placing it within a list of prohibitions that includes murder, adultery, and corrupting children. The directive against abortion appears right alongside prohibitions against killing a child after it's born, implying that from this community's perspective, both acts were equally abhorrent. This gives us a window into the early Christian moral landscape. While discussions about abortion can be fraught and complex in our modern era, the Didache testifies that these concerns are hardly new. Early believers grappled with life and death moral questions, and this document, like a spiritual compass, offered guidance. The Didache doesn't stop stop there. It addresses a wide range of ethical matters and community concerns. For instance, it warns against practicing magic, mixing poisons, or engaging in theft and various forms of exploitation. These instructions likely reflect real issues facing the community. Perhaps some members were tempted by magical charms or potions, or maybe certain individuals were known to cheat their neighbors. By prescribing these behaviors, the Didache aimed to shape a community that stood out from the surrounding society, one that practiced compassion, honesty, and integrity. Towards its conclusion, the Didache turns its attention to eschatology, the study of the end times, by presenting what scholars call its eschatological conclusion in chapter 16. Here, it envisions a period marked by false prophets, community upheavals, and the appearance of the Antichrist before the eventual second coming of Christ. The Didache's apocalypse feels very Jewish in tone, echoing the imagery and language of ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature. At the same time, it includes the distinctively Christian element of Jesus returning at the end of history. This merging of Jewish and Christian eschatological thought underscores the transitional nature of the early Christian movement, which was still closely tied to its Jewish roots, even as it staked out new theological territory. As you follow the Didache's trajectory, from instructions on how to live and worship in the here and now to a grand cosmic vision of how God's plan will unfold at the end of time, you can sense the early Christians' tension between the immediate demands of community life and their hope-filled anticipation of Christ's return. In many ways, this tension still resonates with believers today. We strive to live ethically and meaningfully in the present, while also looking ahead to a promised future of redemption and renewal. As you can see, the Didache is a rare treasure, an ancient guide that grants us direct insight into how second-century Christians might have practiced their faith. It's not a doctrinal manifesto or a mystical vision, but rather an earthy, practical handbook. It shows us believers figuring out how to baptize new members, celebrate Eucharist, uphold a moral community, and await Christ's return. In a world without established denominational structures, printed catechisms, or widely recognized creeds, the Didache helped early communities maintain unity, order, and a distinct Christian identity. Now, we must remember that the Didache never became part of the canonical New Testament. Contrary to the myths that it was once inside the New Testament and later expelled, there's no historical evidence to support that narrative. Instead, the Didache floated in a sort of revered but non-canonical status. Early church fathers like Eusebius of Caesarea mentioned it as familiar, but not part of sacred scripture. Athanasius of Alexandria listed it among recommended readings for new converts, though he did not recognize it as canonical. We also encounter it in the Analecta, attributed to Nicephoros of Constantinople, where it appears among texts considered apocryphal from a New Testament perspective. Because it never joined the ranks of canonical books, the Didache ended up associated with a somewhat fluid category of early Christian literature. This category includes texts that, while not scriptural, were still considered valuable and widely read by many believers in the early centuries. Some of these, over time, would gain greater acceptance, while others would remain outside the official canon. Think of it like an extended reading list recommended by spiritual leaders. There's the authoritative curriculum, the canonical scriptures, and then there's the suggested reading shelf containing works that illuminate, supplement, or inspire believers, but are not on par with the core textbook. This extended reading list included works such as the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Esther, Judith, Tobit, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Gospel to the Hebrews, and the Epistle of Barnabas. Some of these texts, particularly those now known as the deuterocanonical books, eventually ended up in certain Christian canons, for instance the Catholic and Orthodox canons, or at least found a place of respect and study in many Christian traditions. Others, like the Shepherd of Hermas or the Epistle of Barnabas, long hovered in a borderline zone, beloved by some, questioned by others. This dynamic reminds us that what we now take for granted as the Bible was once a developing library, its contents shaped by centuries of use, debate, and discernment. The Didache stands as a testament to that fluid, formative era. By studying it today, we can better understand the roots of Christian traditions that have since grown into towering trees of faith and practice. It's a time capsule, granting us a window into the uncertain yet fertile ground of the early church's first generations, when believers were still establishing how to live out Jesus' teachings in their daily lives. Bonus insight: the Didache's existence challenges us to remember that the early Christian world was far more diverse and evolving than we might imagine. It's easy to think of the New Testament as a neatly packaged library, but in reality, the first believers lived in a literary landscape filled with multiple texts, oral traditions, and community-specific handbooks like the Didache. Learning about this complexity can refresh our understanding of Christian origins, reminding us that what we consider classics today were once living, breathing documents, grappling with the concerns, debates, and spiritual questions of their age. So stay curious and keep digging. The Didache is just one of many texts that help paint a fuller picture of early Christian thought and practice. There are countless ancient writings, some inside the Bible, some outside, that can enrich our understanding of faith's historical journey. Each time you open a long-forgotten document, it's like peering into a distant past, where believers, not so different from us, prayed, struggled, hoped, and did their best to follow a path of righteousness. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into ancient texts, hidden histories, and the scholarly detective work that uncovers new layers of meaning in our spiritual heritage. By exploring documents like the Didache, we learn that faith and practice are always in conversation with the past, shaping who we are and guiding who we might become.